Ba, 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 ba. Okay, I think the delay is over. Okay. The only downside when I do a reading stream is that I don't have an awesome music track to play in the background that I don't want to run into any copyright issues. So that's why it's like all quiet while I'm just like tippity type over here. We just finish over here. We're gonna start soon. I started a little bit late, but that's okay. It's like 3:06 now. We'll see how much reading I actually do today. Okay, stop glowing at me. Okay, hopefully the lighting is not too terrible. Anyway, we're already starting late as it is, because, I don't know, I had to finish cleaning up stuff. But anyway, hello and welcome to the Streaming Parson Reads the Book of Exodus. And if you read in the description, I will be starting from chapter 16. Well, that's not technically I'm going to start a little bit before then, just to like fill the narrative, if you will, because it's kind of weird where like chapter 15 does like half of the chapter is like a song, and then like the other half is like, okay, now we're going to continue the narrative. So I will read that part again, because then chapter 16 doesn't feel like as all of a sudden as it does. But anyway, before we start, I'll be using the New International Version if you want to follow along. I'll be starting from chapter 15, verse 22, actually. But before that, I'm just going to start with a quick word of prayer, and then I'll give a preface, and then we'll just dive right into the text. Heavenly Father, we just thank you for this day. We thank you for this time that we have to read into your word. I just pray that as we read your word, that you would teach us and reveal to us more of who you are and your desires for our lives. And I pray this in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. All right. So, last time when I was reading in Exodus, I had read the last part of the plagues of Egypt and the part where Israel leaves Egypt, and of course all the crazy stuff that happens during that time, right? Where, you know, the parting of the Red Sea, famous scene, in like anyone who even has a remote idea of what happens in the Bible would know the Red Sea story. So there was a whole Red Sea parting, and you know the Israelites travel safely, and then the Egyptians get drowned in it. And of course, there's the part where before that, you know, God himself kills, you know, the firstborn of Egypt. And then there's a chapter 15 has this whole like song of praise and thanksgiving to God for delivering them out of Egypt. And one of the major themes I wanted to pull out of that in chapter 15 was kind of to show the idea that many Christians kind of divorce the idea from which is dangerous because it's biblically dishonest, where we have to acknowledge these kind of scarier aspects of God, if you will, because then if you don't acknowledge it, then the need of repentance is kind of not really present, right? And you find this problematic in a lot of Christian teaching today, where like, one of the biggest things God requires of us is repentance. But if you don't feel like there's a real consequence to our sin, then why would we really like repent of our sin, right? And so I talked about how like, since God is the giver of life and is the source of life, by a weird logical conjunction that I gave, he is also the God of death, which I know sounds like a hot take, right? But the reasoning I had behind that, and I mean really it's more biblical logic than anything, is that since God is the giver of life, he has the power to take it, right? Which is exactly what he does. And so with the Egyptians. And so there's this interesting duality that's shown, and the Red Sea also shows this, right? Where, the Red Sea, he makes a way for Israel, and there's this metaphor of water and life, and the passage through water and life, which is like a form of baptism, right? Kind of, because they don't exactly go into the water, but you get the idea, right? But at the same time, this same water used for baptism is also a symbol of death, which is where baptism gets that imagery from, actually, is the Red Sea, where it has the power to deliver the Israelites and to kill the Egyptians. And so, with that being said, you get to the song in chapter 15 that God is a warrior, but he's also, Israel's deliverer, right? So he's both, right? He's this God is the heroic figure, because of course he is, right? He's God, right? And the Bible is all about what God does, not what people do, right? So one of the things I talked about last time was, I think one of the major dangers in a lot of modern Christian teaching is that they tend to forget that part of, that God had to be violent at times, because that is the narrative of deliverance, right? And I mean, you don't have to look very far outside the Bible to notice this, right? Like every medieval tale is basically that, right? To deliver and save people, the hero has to go fight a whole bunch of people, right? And sometimes fight even monsters, right? I mean, I just finished my Fire Emblem 1 Let's Play, and I kind of talked about it. I only hinted at it. I didn't talk about it as much because I was too busy thinking while I was playing. But, you think of like Marth from Fire Emblem, right? He's this messianic character because he delivers his homeland from the evil dragon, right? And so, in the same way, well, it's the hero's narrative, right? And of course, the Bible attributes this to God because God is the ultimate hero. But this is what chapter 15 in Exodus is kind of getting at, in that it is only God who is the real hero of the story. Of course, the big irony that we're going to run into, and the reason why I wanted to talk about the song in chapter 15 briefly, was because now, once you get past that honeymoon phase of like, God is our hero, then Israel starts having like complaints toward God, which is kind of like ironic, but at the same time it shows the human condition of, to put it nicely, humans are big whiners, right? And so that's where the Exodus narrative is going to pick up, is that after the honeymoon phase of God being Israel's hero from delivering them from Egypt, now Israel's just going to cry a lot because they're going to run into some hardship while traveling in the desert. So that's where we are. And now we're going to start reading from chapter 15 from verse 22. If you want to follow along, I am using the New International Version. Just whip up like a Bible on your desktop or use the Bible app on your phone. I mean, it's free. There's no reason not to use it. I mean, free is free, right? So anyway, here we go. Then Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went into the desert of Shur. For 3 days they traveled in the desert without finding water. When they came to Mara, they could not drink its water because it was bitter, which is why the place is called Mara. So the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What are we to drink?" Then Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. He threw it into the water, and the water became fit to drink. So there the Lord issued a ruling and instruction for them and put them to the test. He said, "If you listen carefully to the Lord your God and do what is right in his eyes, if you pay attention to his commands and keep all his decrees, I will not bring on any of you the diseases I brought upon the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you." Then they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs and 70 palm trees, and they camped near the water. Chapter 16. So the whole Israelite community set out from Elim and came to the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai. On the 15th day of the second month after they had come out of Egypt, so I guess they've been out for like 40 some odd days, in the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death." And the Lord said to Moses, "I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this way I will test them and see whether they will follow my instructions." So on the 6th day they are to prepare what they bring in, and that is to be twice as much as they gather on those other days. So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, "In the evening you will know that it is the Lord who brought you out of Egypt, and in the morning you will see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we that you should grumble against us?" Moses also said, "You will know that it was the Lord when he gives you meat to eat in the evening, and all the bread you want in the morning, because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we? You are not grumbling against us, but against the Lord." Then Moses told Aaron, "Say to the entire Israelite community, 'Come before the Lord, for he has heard your grumbling.'" So while Aaron was speaking to the whole Israelite community, they looked toward the desert, and there was the glory of the Lord appearing in the cloud. So the Lord said to Moses, "I have heard the grumbling of the Israelites. So tell them this: at twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you will be filled with bread. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God." So that evening quail came and covered the camp, and in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. So when the dew was gone, thin flakes like frost on the ground appeared on the desert floor. When the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, "What is it?" For they didn't know what it was. Moses said to them, "It is the bread of the Lord. It is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Everyone is to gather as much as they need. Take an omer for each person you have in your tent." I was just looking at what an omer is. It's roughly like 3 pounds, apparently. That's what my Bible commentary here says. Verse 17. The Israelites did as they were told. Some gathered much, and some gathered little. And when they measured it by the omer, the one who gathered much did not have too much, and the one who gathered little did not have too little. Everyone gathered just as much as they needed. Then Moses said to them, "No one is to keep any of it until morning." However, some of them paid no attention to Moses, so they kept part of it until morning. But it was full of maggots and began to smell, and Moses was angry with them. So each morning everyone gathered as much as they needed, and when the sun grew hot, it melted away. On the 6th day they gathered twice as much, 2 omers for each person, and the leaders of the community came and reported this to Moses. Moses said to them, "This is what the Lord commanded. Tomorrow is to be a day of Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. So bake what you want to bake and boil what you want to boil. Save whatever is left and keep it until morning." And so they saved it into morning, as Moses commanded, and it did not stink or get maggots in it, which has got to be the worst thing if you think about it. "Eat it today," Moses said, "because today is a Sabbath to the Lord. You will not find any of it on the ground today. 6 days you are to gather it, but on the 7th day, the Sabbath, there will not be any." Nevertheless, some of the people went out on the 7th day to gather, but they found none. Then the Lord said to Moses, "How long will you refuse to keep my commands and my instructions? Bear in mind that the Lord has given you the Sabbath, and this is why on the 6th day he gives you bread for 2 days. Everyone is to stay where they are on the 7th day, and no one is to go out." So the people rested on the 7th day. The people of Israel called the bread manna, and it was white like coriander seeds and tasted like wafers made with honey. Moses said, "This is what the Lord has..." Sorry, I need to do Moses' voice. "This is what the Lord has commanded. Take an omer of manna and keep it for generations to come, so you can see the bread I gave you to eat in the wilderness when I brought you out of Egypt." So Moses said to Aaron, "Take a jar and put an omer of manna in it. Then place it before the Lord to be kept for the generations to come." As the Lord commanded Moses, Aaron put the manna with the tablets of the covenant law, so that it might be preserved. The Israelites ate manna 40 years, until they came to a land that was settled. Okay, I'm gonna read from verse 34 again. As the Lord commanded Moses, Aaron put the manna with the tablets of the covenant law, so that it might be preserved. And the Israelites ate manna 40 years, until they came to a land that was settled. They ate manna until they reached the border of Canaan.
Hey, Jamie, it's Jean Jones. I'm just calling to check and see what you're making out. Give me a shout when you have a chance.
Sorry, the answering machine picked it up because I guess there's no one to pick up the phone. Anyway, that was chapter 16. I don't need to read the last verse. It just tells you how much an omer weighed, but I already told you that. So, chapter 16. What can we say about it? Well, I mean, I kind of mentioned this already in the preface, where now we have to deal with Israel whining a lot. And so the first thing that they whine about is the fact that there's no real food where they are, right? Because, I mean, the Bible did tell you that they were walking around for like about 40 days, a little bit over that, because they said it was the 15th day of the 2nd month. So we don't know which month this is, and let's just say 28 days, because of course lunar calendar and stuff like that, right? So 28 plus 15 on the low end would be 43 days. If a month had 31 days, like, you know, we have in like January just now, right? So if it was 31 days, then it would be 46 days, right? So 43 to 46 days Israel's been walking around. So if they had rations brought from Egypt, they probably ate all that by then. And so And it's not easy to hunt and gather when you're like over 1 million people large, right? Because they only counted the men as like 600,000 or something like that, right? This was in an earlier chapter. I don't remember exactly which chapter, but it was a couple chapters ago. Anyway, besides the point. The point is that there was no way they could just hunt and gather, right? For that many people. That'd be ridiculous. And so, 40 days walking around in the desert, they probably ran out of their supplies, and now they're like, well, what the heck, Moses, right? Like, you leave us out here to die because we have no food. Now, I'm going to point out something, and I used to think this was it. Like, I used to be confused by these passages, actually. Because, of course, I had certain wrong preconceptions of the Israelites' life during their enslavement in Egypt. And the passage I'm going to refer to is, where is it? Okay, so this is in verse 3, chapter 16, verse 3. The Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into the desert to starve this entire assembly to death. Now, when I was younger, I used to be confused by this passage and passages like this because, the Israelites will make this same complaint again later. But, you read back in the earlier parts of Exodus about how, the Israelites were slaves in Egypt. But then here we read that, like, oh, wait, they ate full meals every day in Egypt? But I thought they were slaves. Slaves don't get full meals. I thought slaves were just like, given breadcrumbs and treated extremely badly, right? That's what I would think. But if you actually read a lot of documents of the ancient world, you find something pretty shocking. And if you think about like the life of a slave, even like a cartel slave, the life of a slave was actually kind of nice. Now you're probably thinking like, what the heck? Like, how is being subject to someone else's abuse a nice life? Well, think of it like this. Imagine if, let's say you lived in some place and let's say you worked 7 days a week there, which this is where like, okay, slavery might suck because you work every single day. You work 7 days a week there and you don't get paid anything because technically all your payment comes in, you get free housing, all your meals are provided for, you get free healthcare, and you get a bunch of other things just kind of provided for you. But you're still a slave, right? Now people think, well, sweet, free healthcare, free housing, like, isn't that something that we're fighting for people nowadays? Like, shouldn't people have free healthcare and free housing? But at the same time, what happened is that you become dependent on the ruling class, right? So one of the big issues that Israel was having when they were slaves in Egypt was that they had no independence, right? And this, I talked about this way back in Genesis, early parts of Genesis too, where the big purpose of Genesis was to change the mindset of the Israelites, right? Because it is more than likely that the Israelites grew too accustomed to having like their independence taken away. Now, I read this thing the other day. It was like on a Facebook post, and someone was talking about how like a person conditioning a dog, how to feel helpless. And so what the person would do, what the animal abuser would do, was, you had a dog on a leash, right? And then every day you made the leash slightly shorter by taking out one of the chains of the leash. And so as you did that, the dog gets conditioned to always be attached to the leash, and the dog has no real autonomy. Was basically the whole point of the illustration. And so in the same way, this is actually what happened to Israel. And so you wonder, once again, like, how the heck were there so many Israelites despite the fact they were slaves? You would think that, like, there would be a lot more population control. How could the Israelites talk about how they ate every day and ate full meals every day? Now, I used to think that, like, well, maybe they're just making this up, right? That the Israelites were just saying that Moses is just such a crappy leader, that, like, the crumbs that the Egyptians might have given them was equal to a full plate. But the wording doesn't suggest that at all. They're not just talking crap about Moses, but rather they're saying that, like, life in Egypt, we were actually taken care of. But what you see is that, like, the Israelites, they had no identity, right? And this makes sense. When you look at a lot of secular scholars talking about, like, the early Hebrew people, right? The early Hebrew people used to believe for the longest time that they were just, like, a part of like, they started out as Egyptians. They were actually originally Egyptians, and then just a group of Egyptians that moved out of Egypt and then became the Hebrew people, right? And that the Hebrew people actually did not have their origins like they did in Genesis. And that's actually completely logical, right? For anthropologists to believe this, it's completely logical. Um, I actually don't disagree with that assumption that they made. And the reason why I don't disagree, I know it's a hot take, right? Even though, doesn't the Bible say that Israel started with Abraham? But what the anthropologists were getting at was the idea that if there were a different people group living in Egypt, you would not have known they were not Egyptian, because the way that they lived was basically like an Egyptian, right? And just because you were of a different race meant nothing, right? Their identity was Egyptian. And so this is kind of what you see in the book of Exodus. And, this point is actually true. The Bible actually confirms that idea to an extent, right? And so one of the things Moses was trying to achieve when, the Pentateuch, was to remove this mindset from the Israelites that they were Egypt dependent, right? And to become their own people. Now, to be fair, that ain't easy, right? And, we're going to read Moses struggled to do this, right? Even with God's help, right? Where God gave the 10 Commandments and all that, right? And made laws to distinguish Israel from other nations, right? It wasn't easy, right? But at the same time, of course it wouldn't be easy, because the Israelites were so conditioned. Just like the dog analogy that I used earlier, right? They were so conditioned to the short leash, right? And they were to the point that they were like, well, we'd rather have the crappy conditions of being slaves in Egypt, although what we read, that actually the opposite is true, oddly enough. But the big question here is, what is more important? To simply be taken care of, or to be a free people? And that's one of the things that the Bible actually really pokes at, right? Is to be, would you rather be a conditioned slave, or would you want to be someone who's a free person, right? Of course, the gospel takes this on a meta level, right? Not just like between people and people relations, but like humans and sin, right? And of course, there's the whole imagery of sin, us humans being slaves to sin, right? And once again, slavery is not like, it's supposed to be a bad thing, but when you look at it, you're like, it's not that bad, because, well, when I live a sinful life, I'm taken care of, right? I can I can go around and be a complete asshole to people, but I don't have, like, no one has to punish me, because, well, it's my opinion, it's my right to call you an asshole, right? It's my right, though. So, and other people do it all the time, so why can't I call you an asshole as well, right? So, I mean, that's a very light example, but, like, you can take that to extreme cases, and you often find people do, right? If you want a terrible example, you think of like the logic of a rapist, right? Well, she was asking for it, right? What kind? I mean, logically, you think that's absurd, but you know, if we condition ourselves to be slaves of sin, then you can justify those kind of actions, and it's more comfortable to be like, oh, she wanted it, right? By the way she was dressed, it's easier to make that kind of conditioning in people's thinking than to say that like, no, you thinking that makes you an absolutely terrible human being, and you have let sin rule your life, right? It's way easier to just victim blame than it is to be like, okay, no, there's a sin problem in me, and I've been conditioned to be a sinner, right? And that's kind of how most of us live, right? Outside of the person of Jesus Christ who frees us from that, right? And of course, once again, the gospel is taking this freedom from slavery on a meta level, right? To be freed from the slavery of sin, right? And so going back to Exodus is playing at this from a very sociological level, right? Where the Israelites are conditioned to think like the Egyptians and all their ways of thinking. But then, of course, they're second class because they're not born Egyptians, right? So, what would you rather be, a second class citizen who's taken care of, or would you rather be a free person? And that's one of the big arm wrestles that the Bible gets at here in the Exodus story. And of course, the Israelites, their grumbling kind of shows that, well, you know what? It's not so bad to be conditioned if we're taken care of. But at the same time, you lose autonomy when that happens. And we'll see that play out. Of course, this is where the meta level between like humans and slavery to sin will later play out in later books of the Bible. But as far as Exodus is concerned, we only have to look at it from a sociological level. And so I won't bring up the meta narrative as often as I need to, or often as I think I need. I mean, Exodus, you should be able to explain it on its own merit, right? Because, I mean, Exodus is more than well explored, if you will. Anyway, just some trivia things. There's the whole mana and where we get the word mana. And it's funny because like if you think, when you hear the word mana, you think of like magic pool in video games. At least that's what I think. And basically the sense that the Bible is getting at when it uses this word is that mana exists on this like ethereal level, right? And I mean, it makes sense from the way the Bible tells it, right? It's like this weird flaky stuff that just appears on the desert ground and does like things that aren't normal, right? So it appears on the desert ground, which is weird to think about, right? And then it stays there for a while and then it melts as if it was like water. Like, what's going on here, right? And then, of course, the Israelites can eat this and it tastes like wafers, like sweet wafers. Which, yes, the Bible tells you what it tastes like. I remember some people used to wonder, like, what does manna taste like? And it's like, the Bible tells you what it tastes like. But then a lot of people used to... I remember when I was in Sunday school... Sorry. The same person's calling again. I can tell by the caller ID. Anyway, okay, just checking that to make sure. It'd be awkward if my mic was still muted and I chatted this whole time while you heard nothing. So anyway, let me go back to, oh yes, the mana thing. And so, what mana tastes like, apparently it tastes pretty good, right? Because it's supposed to be like a sweet wafer. And you ever had like, I'm trying to think of like a good example of sweet wafers that like you can buy from a store. But like, there used to be, I'm going to show an image of it actually. There's like these kind of wafer things that I used to eat a lot as a kid. Okay, let me just put my display capture on. Like this stuff. This is like Have you ever eaten these things as a kid? And they're like these sweet cracker-like thing. Well, they're not crackers, right? I mean, they're wafers. They're different from crackers, but they're like this, like, you know, thin cracker-like things, I guess. And they have a lot of sugar in it, right? And that's what gives it a sweet taste. And oh man, I used to love these things. I used to love these things as a kid. I mean, I still like them now. I just don't buy them very often. But I assume when the Bible talks about like the wafers being this like crispy thing that has a sweet taste to it, I assume this is what manna tastes like. And you're probably wondering like, well, what the heck? Like manna's so good, right? But you'll find out that Israel ends up getting sick of eating these things because I mean manna is I mean, when you've been walking around the desert for 40 years, eating the same things over and over, you are going to get sick of it, even if it does taste pretty good normally. I mean, there's a reason why we say all things in moderation, right? Anyway, there's the picture of what the wafers, which I assume what manna would taste like. But once again, it's the habitual thing is what ends up being the problem later, and we'll get to there. We'll get to that when the Bible gets there in the story. The other thing that the Israelites are given is that they're given quail, which are like these small birds. And quail is alright to eat. I mean, I eat like the roasted Chinese version of like quail, which I don't know if that's how the Israelites would have eaten it. But once again, quail doesn't taste bad on its own, but when you've been eating it for 40 years, the Israelites are going to get sick of it. But we'll cross that bridge when we get there. But we actually do know the kind of diet that the Israelites ate for 40 years, right? They had basically wafers and quail for like 40 years. And at first it doesn't sound bad, right? Like you can cook quail pretty well. And then like sweet wafers are awesome. But the opinions of the Israelites are kind of flaky, all puns intended. Anyway, that's chapter 16. Let's move on to chapter 17. Now the whole Israelite community set out from the desert of Sin, traveling from place to place as the Lord commanded them. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. So they quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." And Moses replied, Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test?" But the people were thirsty for water, and they grumbled against Moses. And they said, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt and make us and our children and livestock die of thirst?" Then Moses cried out to the Lord, "What am I to do with these people? They're almost ready to stone me." And the Lord answered Moses, "Go out in front of the people. Take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile. I will stand before you by the rock at Horeb. Now strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink." So Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel. And he called the place Massah and Meribah, because the Israelites quarreled, and because they tested the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" Verse 8. Now the Amalekites came and attacked the Israelites at Rephidim. Moses said to Joshua, "Choose some of our men and go out to fight the Amalekites. Tomorrow I will stand on top of the hill with the staff of God in my hands." So Joshua fought the Amalekites as Moses had ordered. And Moses, Aaron, and Hur went to the top of the hill. As long as Moses held up his hands, the Israelites were winning. But whenever he lowered his hands, the Amalekites were winning. When Moses' hands grew tired, they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. Aaron and Hur held his hands up, one on each side, so that his hands remained steady until sunset. So Joshua overcame the Amalekite army with the sword. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Write this on a scroll as something to be remembered, and make sure that Joshua hears it, because I will completely blot out the name of Amalek from under heaven." And Moses built an altar and called it, "The Lord is my banner." And he said, "Because hands were lifted up against the throne of the Lord will be at war against the Amalekites from generation to generation." Chapter 17 is pretty short. So let's just break it down. Chapter 17 is just two little narratives. Pretty straightforward. The first one I already talked in great detail with the whole like manna and quail. And now the Israelites are whining about, not having water. And so like Moses is like, come on, like you guys gonna keep like whining all the time? And God's like, you know what, I'll take care of you guys, so just hit this rock and then like water will come out of it and all that, right? And so God provides for Israel once again, but you kind of see that like, oh, wasn't it better in Egypt than like, you know, to move out? And an analogy that kind of came to mind now, which is, I mean, the irony is not lost on me, is like when people move out for the first time, right? And, there was a time when I didn't live with my parents, but when you move out, right, and you have to start doing things yourself, it ain't easy, right? I mean, for the longest time, I didn't move out until I was like in my 20s, like my mid 20s. And when I moved out for a couple of years, I had to do a lot of things myself that normally I never thought of doing, right? Cooking was a big one. I actually never did any real cooking until I was in my 20s. And it's one of those like Asian household things too, where like, when you're spending a lot of all your high school years and your early college years, and you just study all the time. I was not the best. I was not the most studious student. When you study all the time, your parents, because Asian parents are like, well, we want you to do well in school, so we'll just take care of everything for you, right? So stuff like my laundry, my mom did it for me. Cooking, my parents did it for me. Uh, a lot of the house cleaning, I never did a lot of my own house cleaning. I didn't do a lot of that when I was growing up. And so it was kind of nice to just be taken care of, right? But when you move out and you got to do things yourself, you're like, well, crap, right? Like now I have to actually know how to cook stuff, and assuming you're not just going to eat mac and cheese or just do takeout all the time, right? And so I had to learn a lot of things on my own, and it wasn't easy, right? But of course, one of the most satisfying things when you become an adult is to be able to do stuff yourself, right? And to be able to cook my own meals, and it's like a great feeling, right? Maybe I'm one of those weird people that gets this weird satisfaction. Like, yeah, I can cook my own meals, and it's awesome, right? But the Israelites here are kind of like, well, wasn't it easier when we just lived with the Egyptians and they took care of us, right? When we had water and food back in Egypt, even though, yeah, like, going back to living with your parents, like every kid hates when their parents tell them what to do, right? Every kid hates that. And there's always the whole joke about how like when you move out in college and it's like my dorm is kind of miserable, but absolutely anything is better than living with my parents kind of thing. And that's kind of true with Israel and Egypt, right? And so it's that weird like thing we all go through on a personal level, right? Like, do you want to just be taken care of all the time, or are you going to become an independent person, right? Of course, unfortunately, due to situations in the world today, like COVID, and of course, like the decline of the ebb and flow of generational economics, it's harder for young people nowadays to be able to develop that independence. But with that being said, like many people innately want to develop that independence, even if it is difficult, right? And so you think of like hot take, all right? You ready for the hot take? Like, despite the fact that like sure, because of C19, sure we can get like government checks and stuff, but there's still a lot of people who want to work, and part of that is because people want to be independent. I mean, independence is a great thing, right? You don't want to rely on your government to provide for you. But yet, of course, there are people who would rather just have the government pay for everything, right? Because, I mean, if you don't have to do anything and you just get free money, quote unquote, right? Because it's not really free; it's someone else's money. And then of course, taxpayers get all pissed off, right? Because, you know, I'm a taxpayer, so I have to deal with like, why do I have to pay all this exuberant taxes when I know like half of it is going to go to some undeserving person? I know that makes me sound really mean about it, but I mean, I work security, right? And it's one of those things that just annoys the hell out of me, where it's like, I pay tax dollars, so half these guys can like buy drugs, right? And it's like pisses me off, right? But then of course, other places in the world where they don't pay as much taxes, you run into other problems, right? They have all this classism problem, and you know, not going to name any countries, but those countries know who they are, right? But at the same time, people like those countries, so it's kind of ironic, right? Um, it's like, wait, you do all these like really dickish moves, and yet people love you because I guess you want people to pull up by their bootstraps. Um, what's this? You're not doing handouts? But anyway, back to the whole like Israel wishing they were in Egypt, right? Despite the fact that like didn't weren't they suffering in Egypt? And it makes you wonder, right? Like why would they want to go back? But it is that scary jump, and all of us have to do it in life, where you know you can't rely on other people to be taken care of, right? Like in a way, you have to take care of yourself. Now, of course, some people would say, but in Christianity, don't you have to be taken care of by God? But for the most part, it kind of works like this. The Christian worldview is that, well, God forgives us of our sins so that we can live in the real world and be people and be independent, right? And contrary to popular belief, this is why, like, okay, um, despite being a pastor, I can kind of enjoy, you know, secular media because I'm an independent person. Of course, part of that is that I have to provide for myself in doing that, right? I can't rely on someone else to be able to provide for me for those things, right? And of course, there's the whole like everything in moderation too, right? Which is a different discussion altogether. But one of the Christian worldview believes that people are meant to be free individuals, right? And so we're allowed to have our nuance and personality, right? And it's contrary to the belief where a lot of people shudder at the idea of like, but if I become a Christian, that means we all become kind of um, like robots, right? And we just all do the same thing and whatever, right? It's like, no, I mean, the idea is that God frees us so that, well, I mean, we're not supposed to be free to do sin and to abuse others, of course not. But at the same time, you're an individual who can make your own decisions now, right? And not be a slave to sin. And that's where the whole slave to sin metaphor, why it's so important in the Bible, right? That you are a free person. You're not bound to your sinful nature, but rather you're an independent person who can be free. And so, which I know, like some people would say, well, that's antithetical, right? Because I mean, when people are, when we live in our sinful lives, aren't we free people to do what we want, right? But of course, there's a definition problem of what freedom is, right? Because freedom isn't necessarily doing whatever you want, right? Because you can't be a free person if you just do whatever you want, because then you got to deal with all the repercussions, right? If you just went around, you know, punching every human being because you're a free, you can do whatever you want, like obviously there's gonna be a problem, right? So, and of course, once again, we can take more severe crimes, and you can think of like, you know, we laugh at people's logic why they think they're entitled to do those things, but at the same time, if you wanted to be like, oh no, people can be free and do whatever they want, then technically, you know, what they do is completely fine. But of course, you know, most of us don't believe that, not really, right? And so there's another nuance to what freedom is, and of course, I mean, there's a lot of different dimensions to how we understand what freedom is, right? Like one example is, you know, part of the American Constitution, and by extension the Canadian Charters of Rights, do the same thing, where it's like, well, freedom is about people, despite being different, can live in harmony, right? So, well, what does that mean, right? And so there's certain nuances of like, okay, well, freedom is really about living in harmony, and so we can't just do whatever. If to live in harmony means we can't just do whatever we want, so freedom is clearly not that, right? And so this is something that the Israelites had to learn, right? And of course, freedom in the biblical sense also has to do with how we communicate, not just with God, which is clearly important, but how human beings relate to one another and how they treat one another, right? Which we'll talk a lot more about that when we get to the laws, right? Because that's the whole point of the laws, right? Is how human beings are meant to treat each other, right? But we'll cover that ground because I'm clearly gonna talk about that in great lengths when we get to the laws, but we're not there yet, and I don't want to exhaust it now because then we'd be here for like another hour of me talking about it, right? As opposed to, let's just take snippets of it as we, check off each box. The other thing that happens in chapter 17, the weird magical moments, because remember, this is the Bible we're talking about, is where Joshua fights the Amalekites, well, and the able-bodied men of Israel, I assume, fight the Amalekites, and there's this weird, like, Moses has to hold his hands up with, like, the staff of God, right? So he's standing there like some kind of wizard, and then, like, he has to keep his arms up this whole time, and then, of course, like, the Bible points out that, like, well, Moses gets tired, so his arms start dropping, and then for somehow, like, oh, the other team gets the upper hand just because, like, Moses starts getting tired, and it's just kind of like, the story's trying to get at the idea that, well, it's God's favor toward the Israelites when Moses is able to keep his strength. And so it's kind of like this funny moment where, like, Moses is trying to keep his arms up, and then he starts getting tired. So then, like, Aaron and this guy named Hur, which I gotta say is the funniest name, right? Because it's like, yeah, go ask her. And, what's supposed to say, well, is he talking about some kind of woman? No, it's like this dude named Hur. But of course, this Hur is spelled Hur. Still pronounced the same way. But it's just funny. And there's like a dude named Hur. It's one of those things, not to sound super mean about it, but if you were a dude named Hur, there's no way you don't get bullied in school. But anyway, Aaron and Hur have to, like, support Moses' arms. So they kind of, like, first they get him a chair. They use a rock, but they tried to get him a chair. And then Moses still gets tired even though he's sitting on a rock. And then they, like, hold his arms up for him just so Moses can keep this, like, arm up pose thing like a wizard, right? And it's just kind of funny. And basically, like, yeah. Meanwhile, down in the desert, Joshua has to do all this fighting, right? And so, like, Joshua and his guys are, like, fighting the Amalekites. Of course, one of the funny things, which we'll get to later, because, the whole 40 things the 40 years in the desert thing hasn't actually happened yet. Which I do have to make a side note. When we were talking, I didn't mention it much in chapter 16. I should have. But chapter 16, at the end of it, talks about how, like, oh yeah, the Israelites ate the manna and quail for 40 years. And then the Bible does this thing that, like, when someone tells a story orally, so for example, when you guys watch me on stream, like, we kind of treat it like it's pretty normal. But if you were to read the Bible yourself and you read it, it's one of those really annoying literary things that, like, annoys people with, like, OCD, especially like yours truly. But, like, the Bible kind of, like, says, okay, this happened for this amount of time, and then the next sentence kind of goes like, so during that time, and then kind of like goes back and forth in, like, the timeline. So basically, chapter 16 points out something at the end of the timeline, you know, of Israel's 40 years in the desert. But then chapter 17 kind of goes like, well, sometime during those 40 years, this happened. And then we're going to tell a bunch of stories, right? During the 40 years, of course, one of the stories ends up being how they end up walking around in circles for 40 years because it was a punishment. But anyway, I bring up the whole 40 years thing because it does show something kind of humorous where, like, yeah, Israel walked around for 40 years in the desert, and they were walking around in circles, and the funniest part is that they were actually walking around pretty close to where they were going anyway, right? They were going back to the land of Canaan, and they were actually kind of close because you read in chapter 17 they're fighting the Amalekites, and the Amalekites are one of the inhabitants of Canaan. So if they're fighting the Amalekites, that means they must be kind of close. I mean, if you look at the world map, I mean, Egypt and, the state of Israel, they're actually connected. But of course, because Israel left through the Red Sea, they actually ended up somewhere like in southern Iraq. Probably close to Israel though. Like, let me just whip up the map actually, just so I'm not just saying this and then you're getting confused. Map of Israel. Okay, so I only need this. I don't need like a detailed map. I just kind of need one of these. Can I get this one in big, like, full screen? No. How do you do this? I'm bad at this. Can I just have the image? No, I want just the image. Da, da, da. Open image in new tab. Can I have the image a lot larger, please? Like, this is bad. What's going on here? Oh, you know what? I'm just gonna use this. So anyway, we can use this map right here. So the Red Sea's down here, right? And the Israelites crossed it. Let's say they crossed it over here, right? I guess if they did that, they would have ended in Saudi. And then they probably would have walked around for they walked around for 40 days. And so God probably led them like somewhere up here, like toward Jordan, right? So let's say Israel kind of traveled up to around the border of Jordan. I mean, 40 days, you'd be lucky if you made that distance. Let's say they're somewhere around where the hand is on the map, right? My cursor. And so if they're about here, let's say here, right? Because they would have traveled close to the water because, water is a reliable indicator of how you travel. So let's say they were about here, and then they fought the Amalekites somewhere here, right? They're in they're in northern Saudi. I guess they would not have been in Iraq. I thought Iraq was closer. But anyway, they're actually really close to the land of Canaan, right? Which is, well, modern day Israel and Palestine. And so it's kind of like, yeah, like when God had Israel wander around the desert, they actually just walk around this general area of the map, right? And they weren't allowed to cross from Jordan into what is modern day Israel. And so it's just kind of funny where, like, if they were fighting the Amalekites, they must have been like somewhere here. They must have been pretty close, right? I mean, let's pretend Canaan was a little bit bigger and encompassed a part of Jordan, right? And the Amalekites probably were living like somewhere here, right? So the Amalekites came out, and then they fought the Israelites here. and then like, oh yeah, Israel wins and all that. But it's just kind of funny where Israel was actually kind of already really close to where God was going to send them, right? But of course, there's a reason why Israel ends up not going there for another 40 years. And, we'll cross that bridge when we get there. But I just wanted to point out that, like, yeah, the Israelites ended up walking in a very small area like this. Okay, and get rid of the map now. Anyway, long story short, Israel beats up a bunch of the Amalekites, which actually indicates that they're pretty close to Canaan, where God was going to send them. Just gonna take a short drink break. I have like this mix of like a fruit punch kind of juice, and then I mix it with like this cranberry, like ginger ale kind of thing. I like doing that kind of mix where like, I mean, that's the great thing about ginger ale, right? Is that you can mix it with other stuff pretty easily. I mean, lots of people love their like vodka with ginger ale because it's really good. And so that's what I'm drinking right now. It's like a cranberry ginger ale mixed with like fruit punch, and it's pretty good. Anyway, if you need to grab yourself a drink, I mean, you can do that. Just take a short little like breather because I've been talking a lot in this hour, and guess what? There's going to be more. So just take a short break while I check something here. Okay. Okay. Minute break over. Let's continue on to chapter 18. Chapter 18. Now Jethro, the priest of Midian and father-in-law of Moses, heard of everything God had done for Moses and for his people of Israel. Now the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. Now after Moses had sent away his wife Zipporah, his father-in-law Jethro received her and her 2 sons. One son was named Gershom, for Moses said, I have become a foreigner in a foreign land. And the other was named Eleazar, for he said, My father's God was my helper. He has saved me from the sword of Pharaoh. Now Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, together with Moses' sons and his wife, came to him in the wilderness, where he was camped near the mountain of God. Jethro had sent word to him, I, your father-in-law Jethro, am coming to you with your wife and her 2 sons. So Moses went out to meet his father-in-law, and bowed down and kissed him. They greeted each other and then went into the tent. Now Moses told his father-in-law about everything the Lord had done to Pharaoh and the Egyptians for Israel's sake, and about all the hardships they had met along the way, and how the Lord had saved them. Now Jethro was delighted to hear about all the good things the Lord had done for Israel in rescuing them from the hand of the Egyptians. And he said, Praise be to the Lord, who rescued you from the hand of the Egyptians and of Pharaoh, and who rescued the people from the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all other gods, for he did this to those who had treated Israel arrogantly. Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought a burnt offering and other sacrifices to God. And Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat a meal with Moses' father-in-law in the presence of the Lord. Now the next day Moses took his seat to serve as judge for the people, and they stood around him from morning till evening. When his father-in-law saw all that Moses was doing for the people, he said, "What is this that you are doing for the people? Why do you sit alone to sit as... Why are you... Sorry, let me try that again. Why do you alone sit as judge while all these people stand around you from morning till evening?" Moses answered him, "Because all the people come to me to seek God's will. Whenever they have a dispute, it is brought to me, and I decide between the parties and inform them of God's decrees and instructions." Moses' father-in-law replied, "What you are doing is not good. You and these people who come to serve you will only wear yourselves out. The work is too heavy for you. You cannot handle it alone. Listen now to me, and I will give you some advice. And may God be with you. You must be the people's representative before God and bring their disputes to him. Teach them his decrees and instructions, and show them the way they are to live and how they are to behave. But select capable men from all the people, men who fear God, trustworthy men who hate dishonest gain, and appoint them as officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. Now have them serve as judges for the people at all times, but have them bring every difficult case to you. The simple cases they can decide themselves. That will make your load a lot lighter, because they will share it with you. If you do this, and God so commands, you will be able to stand the strain, and all these people will go home satisfied." Now Moses listened to his father-in-law and did everything he said. He chose capable men from all Israel and made them leaders of the people, officials over thousands, some over hundreds, some over fifties, and tens. And they served as judges for the people at all times. The difficult cases they brought to Moses, but the simple ones they decided themselves. Then Moses sent his father-in-law on his way, and Jethro returned to his own country. And that's chapter 18. So, chapter 18. A lot of... it's one of those funny things. I'm just going to talk about it now because I'm like thinking about it. Where like, when I was in seminary and I had to do courses on like, quote unquote, Christian leadership development. That's what it was called. Or CLD for short. And we talk about how like, in a church, for example, how you run like the church's leadership team and all that stuff, right? And every course, we always come back to this passage, right? About Jethro telling Moses, how to be able to divide up the work, right? Because, of course, it's insane for the idea that one guy does everything, right? I mean, if you look at the Catholic Church, I mean, they got this down, right? They got the Pope, and then the Pope has, like, the circle of the archbishops, right? And then from the archbishops, you got regular bishops, right? And then from the regular bishops, you have... Oh, what's after the... What's lower... What's the next one lower than the bishop? I'm trying to remember. You have the Pope, then you have the archbishops. Well, technically you have... then you have bishops, and then you have, like, the vicars. There you go. The vicars is the next one, right? Most people are familiar with the vicars are, because if you go to a Catholic church, the vicars usually the guy at a particular location, right? So the Pope oversees the entirety of the Catholic Church. The archbishops kind of see, like, large groups of churches within that, right? And large entire organizations within it. Then the bishops are kind of like the regional groups, right? So the archbishop has like several regions, I guess, right, of different Catholic Church, divisions, right? And then the bishop kind of has like certain regions. So, for example, the Catholic Church in Italy has a bishop that kind of does like Italy, right? Archbishop may have like, all of Southern Europe that's kind of like the division, right? And the vicar is like the guy at the local church, right? The local church. And then below the vicar, you have I don't remember all the names of the positions. I should know this better. I'm not Catholic myself, so I'm not overly used to the technical terms of the leadership. But then, like, you know, in a Protestant church, you have, you know, the pastor, you have the lead pastor, then you have the pastor, and then you have like, or pastors rather, you have multiple pastors. At least in a bigger church, you would have multiple pastors, right? Because your church is not that big, you probably only need the one guy. But even then, there's like certain things you run into, right? I mean, how small is your church that you only need one pastor, right? That must be the tiniest church, and at that point, you might as well merge with another one for financial security purposes. But, you know, with like, you know, there's like obviously a system, right? Where, you know, you have one guy who sees the larger community, and then like within that community, you divide them up into groups, right? So let's say an average church has like, average, church is like about 100 people, 100 members. Then, well, the lead pastor obviously has to oversee all of them, but then of course it's divided up between the other pastors, right? And the other pastors take like certain, you know, depending how your church runs, obviously, but you know, the rest of the congregation is kind of divided up in different groups, and then like different pastors oversee them. Of course, like certain churches, they do like the youth pastor, obviously with like the teenagers, and then you have the children's pastor, which is obviously the kids, and then you know you have like your men's group, your women's group, you know, you have different people to kind of be leaders within that setting, right? And then even below you know, just under the pastors, you have the church elders, right? And they kind of oversee those kind of groups, right? Like like men's groups and women's groups and other stuff like that. And so, I mean, this is not even just like a Christian idea, right? I mean, like you think of any business, right? Obviously, you can't have one guy do everything, right? Because that's ridiculous. You think of like Bill Gates and Microsoft, right? Like clearly he doesn't do it all himself, right? That'd be ridiculous considering how massive Microsoft is, right? And so what Jethro is instructing Moses here is that like, yeah, you can't do it yourself. That this is absurd, right? And so, you know, this is where he devises for Moses this kind of like pretty straightforward system, right? Okay, you have different like leaders, and they act as judges to oversee certain sections of the community. And considering the Israelite community is massive, right? It's like well over like, let's say 1.5 million people. I was gonna say about 2 million people. Most people assume that's how many people were actually around, because remember, you have to count all the women and children, right? And so even if you're dividing it with like a leader of 1,000 people, I mean, if you got to sort through like over 1.5 million people, that's like how many, like a basic math here, right? Like they say take away 3 zeros. I'm kind of like bogged down. Sorry, I'm a little slow here. That means you would need like 15,000 leaders, right? For just the thousands, right? And then within that, you gotta like break it down even more, right? To the hundreds, and then to the tens, right? And that ain't easy, right? And obviously, this is also a framework for how Israel was going to set itself up as a society, right? Because there's also something interesting that we kind of overlook when we're looking at, you know, when Jethro is giving Moses this instruction, right? And it's kind of interesting that like, well, I mean, to be fair, I mean, Moses has not been a leader for all that long, but Moses from this scene apparently lacks the foresight to know what the Israelites were going to do when they actually got to Canaan. And the funny thing is that, like, you know, if the Israels didn't screw up in a couple of chapters, you know, they were going to get there pretty quickly because, you know, as I mentioned with chapter 17, the Israelites just fought the Amalekites, and the Amalekites are from Canaan, which means they must be pretty close, right? And so, it's funny how the Bible is kind of hinting at the idea that Moses actually lacked the foresight to know how the Israelites were going to function when they actually got there. And so he didn't have a good system of governance in place, right? Because I mean, what were they gonna do when they actually got to Canaan and it's like, okay, go set up settlements and stuff? Like, how would Israel know how to divide themselves? How would they know how far to go, right? If they only had Moses as their leader, then all 1.5 million of them would have to stay in the same place, and that would just cause all kinds of mayhem, right? So it's kind of interesting that, like, I don't know, the Bible kind of pokes at Moses here a little bit, that Moses lacked the foresight to know how to actually govern a society. But to be fair, I mean, you can't be too harsh on the guy because, I mean, Moses had never done anything like this. And, Moses did kind of try to object God back in chapter 3, saying that, like, well, I don't know how to lead people, right? Send someone else, right? But of course, at the same time, God is making ways for Moses to be able to do this. And his father-in-law is one such figure. Just checking if there's anything else I need to talk about. Not particularly. We are getting to an interesting part. I just want to see how much more I'm going to read today, actually. Okay, I'm going to read one more chapter, because the reason for this is because chapter 20 is a really big chapter. I mean, honestly, chapter 20 could be its own stream. But I mean, chapter 20 and the laws part, right? Because I'm just looking ahead of how many chapters of laws we got to deal with at once. Sorry, just oh wow, this is gonna be like, this is its own crazy, its own long stream, and try and go through every single one of these. I mean, it might even be 2 streams to get through the 10 Commandments and some other laws. So we're only gonna really read one more chapter, which means today's stream is gonna be kind of shorter. But at the same time, I don't want to start the 10 Commandments and then, like, cut it abruptly. So, well, I mean, we'll see. Because here we are at chapter 19, which is the prelude to the 10 Commandments. Chapter 19. So on the first day of the 3rd month after the Israelites left Egypt, so basically roughly 2 weeks from chapter 16, on that very day, they came to the desert of Sinai, after they set out from Rephidim. And they entered the desert of Sinai, and Israel camped there in the desert in front of the mountain. Then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, "This is what you are to say to the descendants of Jacob, and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites." So Moses went back and summoned the elders of the people, and set before them all the words the Lord had commanded him to speak. And the people all responded together, "We will do everything the Lord has said." So Moses brought their answer back to the Lord. Then the Lord said to Moses, "I am going to come to you in a dense cloud, so that the people will hear me speaking with you, and will always put their trust in you." And Moses told the Lord what the people had said. And the Lord said to Moses, "Go to the people, and consecrate them today and tomorrow. Have them wash their clothes, and be ready by the 3rd day, because on that day the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. Now put limits for the people around the mountain, and tell them, Be careful that you do not approach the mountain or touch the foot of it. Whoever touches the mountain is to be put to death. They are to be stoned or shot with arrows. Not a hand is to be laid on them. No person or animal shall be permitted to live. Only when the ram's horn sounds a long blast may they approach the mountain. After Moses had gone down the mountain to the people, he consecrated them, and they washed their clothes. Then he said to the people, "Prepare yourselves for the third day and abstain from sexual relations." On the morning of the third day, there was thunder and lightning, with a thick cloud over the mountain, and a very loud trumpet blast. Now everyone in the camp trembled. Then Moses led the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai was covered with smoke, because the Lord descended on it with fire. The smoke billowed up from it like smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently as the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder. Moses spoke, and the voice of God answered him. Now the Lord descended to the top of Mount Sinai and called Moses to the top of the mountain. So Moses went up, and the Lord said to him, "Go down and warn the people, so they do not force their way to see the Lord, and many of them perish." So even the priests who approach the Lord must consecrate themselves, or the Lord will break out against them. Now Moses said to the Lord, "The people cannot come up to Mount Sinai." Sorry, I gotta do Moses' voice. "The people cannot come up to Mount Sinai, because you yourself warned us. Put limits around the mountain and set it apart as holy." And the Lord replied, "Go down and bring Aaron up with you. But the priests and the people must not force their way through to come up to the Lord, or he will break out against them." So Moses went down to the people and told them. So chapter 19. Really the point of chapter 19 is to set the scene, right? And there's some pretty interesting aspects to the setting of the scene. So let's just kind of talk about it briefly. So, a lot of people wonder, well, what the heck? Like, God shows up and he's like, all right, I'm going to show up at this place. But you see, this place, when I show up, I cannot let people go near it or touch it. Because if you touch it, you got to die, right? And a lot of people would scratch their heads and go, wait a minute, like why would God be so merciless here, right? But you got to look at some of this imagery that's being played around here, right? So there's the thunder and the lightning, there's the fire, there's the trumpet, and then there's the black cloud. And so I'm going to review a part that I talked about on the first week of doing Exodus. And it was the whole why God picks certain forms. And I talked about this in regards to the burning bush scene, right? And what was so important about why God chose the form of a burning bush, right? And the whole thing about the burning bush was that God had done a sacrifice or something weird like that, right? God was doing a sacrifice, which is why Moses was allowed to even be near God, right? Because in chapter 4, there's this hilarious scene where God basically sees God sees Moses and almost murks the guy, right? And in the same way here, you have to keep that in mind when you read this scene. Because when God shows up in this form of the black cloud, right, it's actually very similar to the deliverer back in Exodus 11 and 12, right? And if you remember Exodus 11 and 12, it was the Passover, right? Where God was, killing the Egyptians. So the black cloud symbol is that God is still,
the Dark Avenger, if you will, in this scene. So when people wonder, like, well, why would God make these, prohibitions, against Israel, right? It's because God is very conscious of, like, okay, I'm taking this form, and this form must be respected, right? And so that is and the scene paints it that way, right? That God has this very dark avenger, the warrior, right? He's the violent warrior right now. And of course, there's the trumpet, which is an important factor as well, right? Because when you think of the trumpet, you think of, like of war, and you think of, like, battle cries, right? And so God is using this imagery of battle cries and stuff like that, right? And of course, the thunder and lightning is an add-on to that, right? Because you think of, like, how thunder and lightning is used not just in the Bible, but in mythology in general, right? And it's a war. A warrior has appeared, right? And you think of, like, I mean, this is a trope that's an archetype. Well, it's kind of become more of a trope than an archetype, but it's not exactly an archetype. It's definitely a trope, though, where you know the badass warrior shows up. You think of, like, an anime, uh, with a lot of, you think of, like, anime. Like, a good example is Dragon Ball Z, right? You know, when Goku turns into a Super Saiyan for the first time, right? And him and Frieza are about to have, like, the most epic fight, because now Goku's reached that level where he's, like, able not just to fight Frieza but beat him. You know, it's during this part of the fight where lightning shows up, right? Because this is, like, the battle of warriors, right? And so, like, the lightning and thunder is there, right? You think of, like, Marvel comics, and I mean, obviously, why Thor is a major character in the Avengers, right? Because the lightning and thunder is like, here's a warrior unlike any other, right? Which, I mean, that's kind of Thor's whole thing in Norse mythology, right? Is that he's a warrior unlike any other. And so that's why lightning and thunder go with him, right? And so, in the same way, the Bible obviously is playing on this trope that the lightning and thunder is a representation of a warrior has arrived. And so, because he's this battle god in this scene is a battle hardened warrior, you cannot get close without risk of death, right? And so that is why God gives the prohibition. You cannot touch the mountain when I come in this, with the trumpet and the lightning and the thunder and stuff, right? Because I'm in hardcore warrior mode, right? And of course, people will go, well, why would God pick this form when he's coming to the Mount of Sinai to meet Israel? And I'm still deliberating in my head. It's only 4:30, so I could keep streaming and I could start the 10 Commandments. But with that being said, God is about to give the law here, right? And there's an interesting contrast, and I'll definitely bring this up again as I talk about, the laws, starting with the 10 Commandments, is that when God adopts the form of a warrior, despite the quote-unquote violent nature of a warrior, there is order, right? And so there's supposedly this weird correlation, or rather subversion, if you will, of violence and mayhem and then order. And so this is probably why God picks this form when he shows up on Mount Sinai. But because he had picked this form as opposed to a gentler form, like the burning bush, for instance, the idea that's being conveyed is that, like, there's this harmony between the violent warrior and the order that the world needs, right? Which I know sounds super dark because, like, many people have twisted this idea in history about how only through force can you achieve order. And unfortunately, there is a bit of truth behind that, right? Because if there is no force and no ambition, right, then nothing ever gets done. right? And of course, there's another thing here, which I will definitely talk about more later. But it's also the whole thing about like why God uses male pronouns. And, you can throw your whole like preferred pronoun joke that like, yes, God, his preferred pronoun is he, right? And the idea is that, you know, it is strong men that build a society, right? And so you have to encapsulate all this imagery. And, one of the difficulties of just reading the Bible as text, and I get the struggle, right? I mean, this is why a lot of people would find the Bible boring to read, is because it's not easy to really imagine and think of all this at once. And, this is another reason why you have to, you know, we read the Bible every day, right? Because, you're never going to get this the first time, right? I didn't get this the first time. So, like, I obviously don't blame you if you're not seeing this the first time, right? Because I didn't get it the first time. Heck, it took me how many times to read and study this passage to kind of grasp this idea. And of course, one of the other things too that you probably won't find in most like sermons, because sermons are limited by time constraints. And of course, like Sunday school obviously doesn't spell it this way, but you have to look at the wider narrative, right? You have to look at the Bible in its entirety, and that ain't easy, right? That's something that comes with reading the Bible, every day, and a lot of it, right? At any given time. And so I totally get if like there's a bit of confusion about this scene and why it's so weird. But at the same time, I hope that my explanation can bridge for you what's happening in chapter 19 and all the important stuff that's going to show up starting from chapter 20, that's starting with the 10 commandments, and God's going to give a whole bunch of laws. Because I mean, we're going to be reading like laws that God gives to Moses for like well over like maybe even 2-3 streams. So actually I am going to continue and start reading the 10 commandments, which is weird to start reading the 10 commandments in the middle of a stream as opposed to starting a stream with it. But I'm going to keep reading because there's just so much here. And I may like, if I end up like rambling too much during the 10 commandments, because there's just so much content. Like I said earlier, chapter 20 can be its own stream, honestly. And then of course I'd have to spend like two extra streams after that to read the rest of the laws before we get to the golden calf story. But there's just so much to unpack here. But chapter 19 is meant to set this scene, right? That with the law coming and the revelation of the law, God has to set up this scene in the way that he wants the law to be approached. Which is another thing that, like, why chapter 19 is kind of a slept on chapter, even though it's so important to understanding so much of Exodus, right? Because one of the dangers of, when you read the Bible in a very dry fashion and you read through like the 10 commandments and the rest of the laws, and it's easy to just kind of read them in a vacuum and forget, you just read it as like a list of rules, right? As opposed to, this is the forceful reality of how we can have order. Because of course, in contrast to the ancient world, there was a lot of disorder. And this is one of those things where, like, if you were to watch this stream and then go, or if you were to watch this stream and maybe the next one that I do next week, and then go back to Genesis, then a lot of Genesis makes actually a lot more sense. But, I mean, I've given my whole spiel of why that's the case, right? And you can go watch the Genesis streams for that. I'm not going to spell it out again here because then I'm just wasting time at that point. Anyway, we have now set up the scene. God in the black cloud, the dark avenging warrior, has entered Mount Sinai. And what does God start doing when he is descended upon Moses? Chapter 20. I'm just going to take a quick drink here because there's going to be a lot of reading. And God spoke all of these words. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt and out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make... Sorry, my cat just came in. I'm going to read that part again. Shh, quiet. I'm reading, Missy. Anyway, okay, let's try that again. Verse 3. You shall have no other gods before me, and you shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on earth, or below in the waters. You shall not bow to them or worship them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. Now remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servants, nor your animals, or any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Now honor your father and your mother, so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving to you. You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not give false testimony against your neighbor, you shall not covet your neighbor's house, nor your neighbor's wife, nor his male or female servant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Now when the people saw the thunder and lightning, and heard the trumpet sound, and saw the mountain in smoke, they trembled with fear, and they stayed at a distance, and said to Moses, Speak to us yourself, and we will listen, but do not have God speak to us, or we will die. So Moses said to the people, Do not be afraid. God has come to test you, so that the fear of God will be with you to keep you from sinning. The people remained at a distance, while Moses approached the thick darkness where God was. And the Lord said to Moses, Tell the Israelites this, You have seen for yourselves that I have spoken to you from heaven. Do not make any gods to be alongside me. Do not make for yourself gods of silver or gold. Make an altar of earth for me and sacrifice it, your burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, your sheep and goats and your cattle. Wherever I cause my name to be honored, I will come to you and I will bless you. If you make an altar of stone for me, do not build it with dressed stones, for you will defile it if you use a tool on it. And do not go up to my altar on steps, or your private parts may be exposed. It's an interesting way to end the chapter. But that is chapter 20, and boy howdy, we got a lot to unpack here. So, chapter 20, the 10 Commandments. And boy howdy, there's a lot to say about them. Because oddly enough, there's many mistakes about the Ten Commandments that a lot of people make because, well, usually when people learn about the Ten Commandments, they're just kind of told like a Sunday school version. Not that I'm bashing Sunday schools, but like, a watered down version because, Sunday schools can't be as um, forthcoming with some of these commandments for obvious reasons. And then, of course, media portrayals of the Ten Commandments is not fully accurate. And then, of course, many people misinterpret a lot of the stuff that is said because of that. So, the first one is actually what the first commandment is, which is actually not a command at all. And I know this is like super elitism moment, right? Because I studied Hebrew, so I know this, right? But it's kind of important to get this out of the way, that the first commandment is actually not a command at all, but rather it is a statement. And really, the 10 commandments are the 10 statements. So the first statement is when God says, I am the Lord your God who delivered you out of Egypt and out of slavery, out of the land of slavery, which is actually the first commandment. Now, the reason why this is actually the first commandment, if you look at it logically in the 10 commandments, is that God is once again setting the foundation of the rest of the commandments, right? And I already talked about this in chapter 19 with the whole setup, right? That despite the fact that God takes on the form of the reaper, really, he is setting down ways for people to live, which is kind of ironic, right? But God is setting down the foundation of which this is how you are to live, right? And so the first commandment is him kind of spelling this out, right? I'm the person who did all those things in Egypt. And yeah, they were pretty harsh, right? He sent plagues, he killed a whole bunch of Egyptians, and then he killed even more through the Red Sea. He did all of that, right? It is God who did it. No human being did this, right? And of course, chapter 20 begins the whole thing with like, and God said all these things, right? Now, the reason why this is important is because it's putting this central idea that in layman's terms, morality comes from God and God alone, right? And because it is God who delivered Israel, then it is his word is law, right? As opposed to, well, no, actually, I want to decide what I get to do. And it's like, no, 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 no. You don't get to decide that for yourself, right? Because clearly, you've seen how that worked out for you back in Egypt, right? When the Egyptians kind of treated you however they wanted to, right? And look how great that worked out for you, right? And so God is setting up that like, no, I'm the one who's coming up with these laws, right? And you cannot say a human being did this, because if a human being did it, you can eventually overwrite it. And that's the other thing too about the commandments and about, associating God with morality, is because you got to put it from a practical sense, right? If a human being came up with laws for human beings to follow, then since all human beings are relatively, for the most part, we're all the same, then if you went up to me and said, okay, Michael, you can't, I don't know, you can't, as a pastor, you can't play video games. And I said, well, who the hell are you to tell me what to do, right? That would be my easy response. I'd be like, well, who the hell are you? You can't tell me what to do, right? And that's usually how human beings tend to treat each other, right? When we try to tell other people what to do, usually that's our first response, right? Is who are you to tell me what to do? And so when God says that, like, no, I'm the one setting up the rules here, you can't really challenge God on it, especially considering who he is, as he just labeled in the first statement. Now, an interesting observation is how God identifies himself. Similar to the whole black cloud form thing, God identifies himself as a warrior here, right? He says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt and out of the land of slavery. So when God identifies himself to Israel, he identifies himself as the deliverer. Because if you actually read it, and a lot of people ask this question, and the simple answer is like, I think God wants to have a understanding between people and God and their relationship. And of course, this is relevant to Christian relationship with Jesus on a meta level, but we'll get to that. I hear the question of, well, why didn't God say, I am the Lord God who created the universe? I mean, if God had said that, I mean, that'd be enough reason to be like, well, you better listen to me, right? But, you kind of see that, like, merely the giving of life is not enough to make someone do something for you, right? And we can see this easily on, like, on a human level, right? You ever watch, like, I'm trying to think of, like, a good example of this. Well, I mean, like, you ever read Frankenstein, right? Frankenstein actually points at this pretty well, right? And the whole theme of the Frankenstein story is, you are who you decide to be, right? That's kind of the main theme of Frankenstein. And so the big conflict is the creature has to be, well, who is he really? Is he the will of Dr. Frankenstein? The creature, is he the will of Dr. Frankenstein, or is he his own person? That's kind of the whole point of that story. And so, Dr. Frankenstein, he says the line that, like, so many narratives use, because once again, there's this important theme about your relationship to a higher power. And so there's this line Dr. Frankenstein uses when Frankenstein starts to rebel. Or sorry, when the creature starts to rebel. And Dr. Frankenstein says the famous, I made you and I can unmake you. And then of course, the creature he doesn't like that very much. And I mean, that's used in so many media. Frankenstein is an archetype of that, kind of dynamic, right? And so, the Bible, even though it predates Frankenstein by, like, over 4 millennia, at least, the Ten Commandments predates Frankenstein by like 3 millennia at least. God does not use that statement to say that, well, I made you, I can unmake you, because that is not how you get someone to love you, right? That's not really a good enough reason for someone to love you, right? And so, I mean, God is not an idiot in that sense, right? He's not Dr. Frankenstein who threatens the creature's life with, well, I made you, I can unmake you. So instead, God relates himself with people with the fact that, like, despite the fact that God doesn't have to do this, he does something worthy of admiration, because that's human nature. Human nature requires admiration. That's just the way it is, right? I mean, we do it all the time with one another. We strive for admiration, and there's nothing wrong with that in a vacuum, right? There's nothing wrong with striving for admiration, on its own thing, right? It's when you become arrogant about it and demand it from people, you've crossed the line. But, desiring admiration from others is completely normal, right? I mean, I would say there's something wrong with you if you didn't desire admiration from others, right? I would say there's something wrong with you, right? Because as human beings, we crave admiration, right? Our validation is so important, right? That's completely normal. And so, in a funny way, God plays on human terms here, right? So he says, he identifies himself as something worth of admiration, as opposed to, I made you, I can unmake you. And so, once again, the whole Black Cloud, Dark Avenger imagery is relevant here, right? Because God is not threatening humans by saying, I can unmake you, so you better listen up. Like, God doesn't do that, right? And in a way, that actually shows he's actually quite loving, right? He doesn't tell people to obey him out of a threat, but rather he does it through an admiration thing. He does it through something that's completely sensible that all of us crave from one another, right? And so God is establishing this relational aspect between, not just between himself and humans, but he's given an example for how humans also should relate to one another, which is fundamentally why God makes the laws the way he does, right? It's ultimately for human benefit and how humans relate to one another. So that's the big observation of the first commandment, right? Is that why does God say, I'm the one who delivered you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery, versus saying like, well, I'm the creator of the universe, so you better listen up, right? But rather God says you should probably listen to a guy who's done something worthwhile, right? I'm a guy worth my salt, is what God is kind of saying here, right? If you were to kind of TLDR it. Now, this is where a lot of people get moving on to the next commandment. A lot of people think this is the first commandment, but it's actually not. This is actually the second commandment. And the second commandment is, you shall have no other gods before me. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're probably thinking, but isn't the second commandment not to make idols? Well, this once again is like, I know a lot of people say pastors should not do this because it can like disorient your listeners. But at the same time, if you don't do this, especially when it's important in something like the Ten Commandments, you're actually teeter-tottering on biblical dishonesty, and I'd rather not do that. So I'd rather possibly confuse you guys with tough linguistical nuances than to have biblical dishonesty, right? Because I can always clear up confusion. What I can't do is repair damage from biblical dishonesty. So I'm going to go the safe route and confuse you, then decrease your trust in Scripture. How about that? So, the second commandment is, you shall have no other gods before me. And in the Hebrew text, the next part is actually explaining what that means. It is what we call a participle sentence. A participle is when you're explaining like what the earlier sentence means. It's kind of how semicolons work in English, right? You have a statement, semicolon, and then you're explaining the stuff you just said, right? That's how a semicolon works, by the way. For those of you who are wondering, what the heck is, what's a semicolon for in English? But anyway, um, think of the break between verse 3 and 4 as like a semicolon. And the semicolon is the explanation of, you shall not have gods before me. And God explains, don't make images, don't worship, man-made gods out of silver and gold, and don't worship nature itself like the Egyptians do, with the nature gods. Don't do that, right? That's what it means to not have any other gods before him, right? So those verse 3 and 4 are not two separate commands, but they're rather one. It's one commandment with an explanation. And so God is saying that, like, okay, don't worship nature itself, like, anything in the heavens above or the earth beneath or the waters below. You shall not bow down to them, so on and so on. And so, I mean, the second commandment is pretty self-explanatory, right? God's saying, well, I'm the Lord your God. And so you're not supposed to put anyone relatively equal to me, right? Because there is no one like me, is what God is getting at. And once again, this is why you have to understand that the first commandment is actually the statement of how God identifies himself, right? Because you think of this, the Frankenstein illustration, right? And that's how nature gods are generally treated, right? Well, the nature gods made me and they can unmake me. But God says, I'm not like that. I'm not going to threaten your life like that. And that shows that God actually is loving. It's kind of I know you might want to think that it's kind of twisted, but I mean, it's not remotely as twisted as how people would approach a nature god, right? A nature god would act like Dr. Frankenstein. I made you, I can unmake you. And God not threatening our lives like that, it shows that he's loving, right? And he's saying that like, well, I show my love by being willing to kill for you, for starters, right? Because, it's one of those things where people criticize God. It's like, well, if God is so perfect, why would he need to kill people, right? And as messed up as it sounds, it's like, well, God does it because he loves you that much, right? God is willing to kill because he loves you, right? And in a way is the ultimate form of love, right? That you're willing to do anything for that person. And God is willing to do anything for the Israelites. Which I know, like, in a vacuum, that sounds kind of twisted, but I mean, that's God's logic in a nutshell, right? That God is willing to do anything, even though he doesn't have to do anything, right? And so there's that kind of interesting nuance. And once again, the second commandment, God is saying, don't compare me to these nature gods who threaten your existence, right? A nature god will tell you, I made you, I can unmake you. God says, no, I don't treat you like that because I love you. And that's the big difference, right? Between the God of the Bible and say, like, the nature gods, right? God doesn't threaten us because he loves us. And that's why, in the Pentateuch, God never uses the whole like I created you argument to of like why, I deserve your admiration, right? So that's something that you have to look at those two commandments that way, because then the rest of the commandments make a lot more sense, right? Why does God require these certain things from us, right? Because God does not threaten, he doesn't want to threaten our lives with, the threat of unmaking us, right? Even though, this is this, here he is running around with a sickle basically, right? And, his lightning and his trumpet, right? And he's the warrior here. But at the same time, he's not here to threaten our lives. So there's that weird, I know it's weird that way, that like the imagery doesn't quite fit the wording, but I think the contrast is supposed to be like a subversion to the human expectation of how God would approach order. And subvert our expectations of love as well, which is relevant. Okay, continuing on. So we get to the third commandment, one of the most misunderstood commandments. And it is, you shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. Many people refer to this as when like people say like, Jesus Christ as like a curse word, right? When, someone gets frustrated and they throw out that word, which of course, like on the one hand, you still shouldn't say stuff like that. But that's not what this passage means. There are other passages that do refer to stuff like that. Like you don't take holy names and use them like curse words, right? There's other passages in the New Testament that definitely do this, but that's not the same thing as what's being said here in Exodus. And it's understandable why people would actually like kind of misinterpret, because it's easy to blend those passages together, like the New Testament stuff about stuff we shouldn't say, and then like, this passage about misusing the name of the Lord. But when the Bible talks about misusing, you have to, the English translation of misuse is an interesting word choice. Because what the English translator here is trying to get at is their best interpretation of how the Greek and the Hebrew understand this sense of like the name of God as like an object, as like a tool that you use, right? Like a hammer, right? So in a way, it's like you're using something as if it were an object, which requires an action, right? That's kind of what the Bible was. That's what the commandment was actually getting at, is like an action, right? Not just something you say. And so many Christians rightly now interpret it as like the way you act, which makes way more sense, because the consequence that God gives in regards to misusing the name of the Lord, it makes way more sense, right? Because I remember watching this video on PragerU, and it's actually pretty good, about how like many people misinterpret misusing the name of God, and then there's a certain logical fallacy when people talk about it being about like saying the name of God, you know, unnecessarily. And so he made a joke about how like why would people think that God could forgive something like murder, but then he can't forgive someone for saying, God, I had a hard day at work today, right? Like that doesn't make any logical sense, right? And that would make God kind of seem really contradictory to his nature, right? And so then raises the question, well, what does Exodus, 7 mean when it talks about misusing the name of God? And the proper way to understand this is that these are actions, right? Now, I know I'm gonna touch on a little controversial thing now, and it's many people's interpretation of the mark of the beast, right? And the whole 666 thing, the mark of the beast. And so when people talk about like, okay, the mark of the beast has this symbol on the forehead and on the right hand. Now, of course, most people would understand that that's actually not a literal thing. Like you don't get a marking on your forehead and on your hand, right? It's not merely an object, but rather when it talks about the mark of the beast being on the forehead and on the right hand, it refers to something of the mind and your actions, right? And we always use the right hand as metaphor for action. Insert masturbation joke here, but it's about what you think and about your actions. And so when it talks about misusing the name of the Lord, it refers to that kind of thing, right? What you think and how you act about it. And so, yes, words can affect it, right? Because the Bible also talks about all kinds of unwholesome speech, using your tongue to curse people and blah 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 and all that stuff, right? Which is all true. But it goes beyond that. It goes into your actions. And then you have to consider, well, what actions can happen that would misuse the name of God, right? And the simple answer is religious evil. Now, I'm going to go into a kind of a hot take here because part of this is anecdotal. And I know a lot, if you're watching this and you might think, well, you're just a sour human being for thinking this, right? And, you're allowed, sure, you could be right on this, right? So I'll tell you this anecdotal story about my encounter of people misusing the name of God. So, working security sucks, all right? I hate the job. Why lie about it? And I'll tell you why I hate it so much and why I'm always sour. I'm really sour about it. Is because, what do you do as a security job, right? As a security guard? Well, you're trying to prevent people from stealing stuff, you kick out trespassers, and stuff like that. And when you're working in troublesome areas, places that have higher crime rates, and you have to kind of be like, very assertive as a guard, say like, okay, I'm kicking this guy out because, this guy's caused trouble for this store in the past or whatever, right? This guy is a known shoplifter, and as a guard, you kind of have to do with like extreme prejudice, right? But then you always get those people that are always like, on the one hand, they try to be sympathetic, right? You want to be sympathetic to the people who don't have things, right? People steal because they have to do it to live, right? But your job as a security guard is like, no, unacceptable, right? So anyway, one of the places I had to work at was a McDonald's. And you know this McDonald's sucks if it needs a security guard. Okay, why lie about it? The place sucks. And so, there's always some guy who comes in and he wants free food, right? And he'll beg people in the store for money. But you can't do that. That's not legal. You can't solicit money when you're inside an establishment. That's actually not legal. So you gotta kick these guys out, or else you get the cops to take them away, right? And I have had people, I kid you not, I've had people, say stuff like, if there was a God, he would do something about you. Who are you to deny these people food? Who are you to deny these people, the ability to do stuff in the McDonald's, like, to use the bathroom to clean themselves because they don't have a house? Who are you? And people have, would actually get really upfront about the security guard, right? Because the security guard is like he's the bane of existence, right? He is the root of evil, right? And I have had people I recognize, and I know these people, and I keep my mouth closed. Like, I actually know who you are, so you better not say this shit around me, right? People have used the name of God to curse me, to say that, like, if when Christ comes, you will be the first punished. If God were to decide now, he would punish someone like you because you're a person of injustice, right? As a security guard, of course I'm evil. I'm evil incarnate, right? So people would say stuff like that. Say, in Jesus' name, I hope something bad happens to you because you're an evil person. People have said this to me, and I'm like, what the actual shit, right? Like, are you really gonna say stuff like, in Jesus' name, a curse on someone else? Like, who the hell are you? Who do you think you are? Right? Of course, as a security guard, you have to be like, yeah, be nice about it. But, deep down, one that hurts, as what I believe is like Jesus, I believe Jesus is about love. I pray for, I pray for my enemies, right? Whatever happened to that, right? Whatever happened to, love your enemies, right? Yeah, I know I am the bane of existence. I am the root of evil. I am evil incarnate as a security guard. Of course, I acknowledge that. At least, because everyone else tells me that, right? And everybody wishes I was dead because I'm a security guard, right? People wish I was dead. The world would be better without me. But you know how damning it is? And imagine if other people around hear people use the name of Christ to curse a security guard, right? Like, people will say, well, like, why would anyone want to believe in a God like that? Any rational human being would think that, right? So, you think of religious evil, right? And that's what the Bible is actually getting at when it talks about do not misuse the name of God. Because if you think of it like logically here, right? If people are saying stuff like, well, in Jesus' name, you be damned for, not letting people have free food, right? Or not letting this guy who has to steal to live, right? You be goddamned. And then imagine if other people heard this and they're like, whoa, right? Jesus damning, people because of preventing theft? Like, what kind of, I wouldn't want to worship a God like that, right? And so, if you lead people to think that way, right? And Jesus talks about this kind of thing too. If you lead people away from God because of your speech, like, that's a very serious offense. And so, why is this such a serious offense? Well, you have to look at the earlier two commandments, right? God is saying that he wants Israel to trust him because he loves them. That's why he delivered them from Egypt. And because of that, he doesn't threaten our lives with, like, I made you, I can unmake you. So you do not take that love and mercy that God had given and misuse it to abuse someone else. That's what the third commandment is actually talking about. Because, I mean, if you think of it logically, when people do this kind of thing of religious evil, then you take away the idea that, well, God cannot be equated to morality, which is the ultimate downfall to any society, right? And, whether hot take, other religions understand this idea well enough, right? I mean, you can think of another example, a well-known one is like, okay, many people are talking about like, anti-Muslim, anti-Islam ideas, right? And people slamming like Islam. Well, part of it is because of, well, extremists that would tarnish, their religious beliefs, right? And then when extremists do what they do, then people take a step back and go, well, hold up, right? Is this what your doctrine teaches, or have you twisted it? And if you've twisted it, well, the damage has been done to the point that I don't know if we can repair it, right? And that's why Islam is under as much scrutiny as it is, right? It's the exact same idea, right? And that's why religious evil is so dangerous. I mean, and so many people are quick to jump against. This is another reason why people are quick to jump against Christianity at times, right? You think of like colonialism, right? And a lot of evil that Christians did, right? And then people talk about like, well, that's religious evil, and that's almost irreparable. And that is true to a wide extent, right? When you commit religious evil, it is almost irreparable in people's minds. And I mean, logically so, right? Because, when you read in the book of Exodus, God equates himself with goodness, love, and morality. And if that description of God is misused, if the name of God is misused, then you move away from how God associates himself with love, mercy, and all those things, right? And then, of course, once you've divorced God from that, then you wouldn't want to worship God. Completely logical. Which is why this is such a serious sin, right? To misuse the name of God, and why God says he will not hold guiltless, right? Because that is a very serious crime against God, to basically divorce him from the idea of goodness. And if you do that, then that would prevent, that's leading people away from God. And Jesus makes this whole big deal about it in in the Gospels, and he's when he rips into the Pharisees about it, right? And the Sadducees, and he's like, well, you sit at the gates of heaven and you lead people away, right? Like, you are the worst of the worst, right? And so it comes back to this commandment of misusing the name of God. And of course it's one of the biggest crimes, because things like that are almost irreparable. You cannot fix it once the damage has been done. It's that serious. And if you are the cause of leading people away from God, and Jesus says it with some very strong language, better to have a rock wrapped around your neck and thrown into the ocean to drown, right? Like better is that guy than the guy who leads people away from God, right? And that's what the misuse of the name of the Lord actually refers to. Anyway, the reason why I had to go so much into that passage or that commandment, because it is one of the most misunderstood ones. Of course, yes, swearing is a problem, but that's not what this commandment is referring to. Because I will explain in a later commandment, there's actually a kind of tier list, if you will, of like the first commandment being the most important one, obviously. And then as you move down, it goes from like your heart and your mind, and then applied to action, right? So the action ones are kind of like lower on the tier list, even though they're pretty important. But at the same time, it's your attitude and your heart. And, we already have that with the first three commandments, right? The attitude that we must have is that God is good, God is loving, and he doesn't threaten us, and we must honor those things about him and never abuse that. Then we get to the fourth commandment, which kind of takes a tone shift, ironically enough, and it talks about the Sabbath day. Now, the fourth commandment is the whole remember the Sabbath, which the Lord has made holy. 6th day the Lord worked and took a rest on the 7th, and so in the same way you must as well. Now, it kind of has a weird tone shift where it's like before God's like super dead serious about this. You better not, misrepresent me because, I'm here to bring order and goodness in the world of men, right? And then now it's like, well, the importance of rest and being a free people, kind of giving it away, and why the Sabbath is important. So what's the big deal about the Sabbath, right? Well, the Sabbath is about Israel being a free people, which is hilarious to think about because, we just read in the earlier chapters that Israel doesn't care as much about being free people than they do about being taken care of by their slave owners, right? And so God is saying, I want you to be a free people. And in order to do that, I'm going to make you live as if you were free people. And part of that is by taking a day off, the Sabbath day. Now, the reason why this is important is because, we reflect back on when the Israelites were living in Egypt. And, when they were living in Egypt, you don't get a day off. You work 7 days a week, right? Because your slave master tells you to. Free people get to have a break. Free people get to have days off, right? And so that's kind of what God is getting at with the Sabbath command, right? You are to be free people. And you are to extend this freedom to others, right? To the foreigner who lives among you, to your servants, even to your animals, right? Which is a weird idea, right? Your animals get to have like certain freedoms, right? And so God wants the people of Israel to be free. And being able to rest is a symbol of that freedom because slaves don't get to rest. They're told, when you're told to work, you work. End of story, right? That's the life of a slave. A free person can make decisions like, no, I can have days off. I can do this and that freely. And the Sabbath is a reminder of that. Now, the funny thing is, once again, when God himself says, well, I worked 6 days and rested on the 7th, right? Which tells you something interesting about the nature of God. So if you reflect back on the whole, God being Israel's deliverer, but at the same time, God is a free being because he can choose stuff like the Sabbath for himself, right? He could have been like, I don't have to do anything. I mean, he's God and all, so of course he doesn't have to do anything. But when God chooses to save Israel, despite that he's a free person, right? It's once again to express this idea that God is, God is love, right? Because he chooses to save Israel, even though he doesn't have to do anything. And this is how you define, the Sabbath is how you define love in a weird way, right? Because free people can choose not to do something. I don't have to show respect or show love to anyone if I don't want to. I'm free to do that. But it means so much more if I choose to love. And that's, a thing many Christians would express about their relationship with God, right? It's so great that I can choose to love God, right? As opposed to being forced to love God, right? Once again, that's why the second commandment is in relation to the fourth one, right? God doesn't threaten us with, I made you, I can unmake you. But rather, we love God and we choose to love God. And that means so much more, right? And I mean, obviously the reverse is true. God doesn't have to love people, but he does. Because and that shows that he is love, right? That he always chooses to love us, even, despite our sin. God loves us, right? And continues to love us. And so the Sabbath is an important part of that aspect of God, because God always chooses to love, right? He, despite the fact that God can choose not to, I mean, he's God, he can make any decision he wants to, but he chooses to love us even with our sin, right? And despite that, which is what makes, once again, it just shows how awesome God is, right? Now, there's a lot more I could say about the Sabbath, but I think I'm going to leave it at that. Because once again, now I realize, see, like, it's already 5:30, and I got to end the stream in like less than half an hour, and we still got like a bunch of these commandments to go. So I ran into the very danger I was worried about, and now I'm paying the consequences. So now we got to speed this up. All right, commandment number 5: honor your father and your mother, so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you. Now, this one is, many people rightly point out that this is the first commandment that actually directly involves other human beings, right? And of course, in a person's life, the people that should be high priority of humans you respect are your own parents, right? And there's that whole funny, like, well, your parents brought you into this world, so that's a good enough reason, right? But, your parents are an emulation of God on earth to you. That's kind of the importance of parents, right? I mean, at least that's how it should be, right? Good, godly parent. In Christian circles kind of dance around this idea where they talk about like how good, godly parents, can really shape their kids, right? And the idea is that your parents are meant to be your first emulation of God on earth to you, right? Because, the New Testament points out, well, how can we say we love God if we can't love our brother? The brother who you can see, whereas God you cannot see, right? And the same idea is expressed with your parents, right? Your parents you can see for the most, I mean, assuming you have decent parents, and unfortunately there are a lot of parents who walk, we have a problem of fatherless families, right? Dads that walk out. And we have every right to call them complete scumbags, right? Because a parent is supposed to be a person's, their child's first contact with God. I know it sounds weird to put it that way, but that is the role of a parent, right? That's the ultimate role of a parent, actually, is to be a child's first contact with God. And, I thought about this when there was you ever watched this show called That 70s Show? It's an old show. It's been discontinued for years now. It's an old show. But That 70s Show was a show about, well, a bunch of people in the late 70s. And the main character, Eric Foreman, he's scared of his dad all the time, right? And some people would tell him, well, why don't you just stand up to him, right? Because Red Foreman can be he's a little bit of abusive at times. He's a little bit of a jerk, right? Because, Red is so set in his ways. And Eric is like, why would I oppose him? He's basically God, right? And so, as much as that's used as a joke, there's a lot of truth in that, actually, right? And the idea is that your parents are first contact with God, which, once again, this makes sense when you put commandment 3 in perspective, right? This is a reason why parents cannot, it's definitely on the parents to represent God well, right? And the idea of God well, to be more vague, right? If a parent fails to do this, you're in deep crap, right? That is the collapse of society in a nutshell. And unfortunately, that's kind of what's hot take. Another hot take. We got lots of hot takes, but I mean, then again, I'm reading the Bible, so we're full of hot takes today. But, we kind of see that in the world today, right? And that is naturally what's going to happen when you have so many like fatherless homes, right? And a big result of that is going to be people with no respect for society. And I mean, to be fair, why should people have a respect for society, right? If we have these problems of like low value on the family, all these fatherless homes, and back when Barack Obama was a senator, so like 2008, even before that, when he was like running to be the president in 2008, Barack Obama himself said, like one of the biggest problems in America is this massive decline of fathers, right? And families that single mother, single parent families, single mother families mostly, right? And it was like a big problem of why America was going down the crapper. And I mean, of course, Obama was right about that, right? Because when the person who, why a father figure is so important is that, in a lot of ways, your first contact with God is not is absent, right? Then it's easy for people to believe, well, if there was a God, he's clearly not here, right? And so if you have that mindset, that kind of leads to all kinds of lawlessness and, easily allows evil, right? After all, the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, right? And the absence of God is the beginning of all evil, right? And so this is why the Bible points out to honor your parents, right? And why it's such a big deal. Because they're the people who are supposed to be your first contact with God, you should recognize that and live up to the goodness required of you. And that begins with honoring parents. And that's why, like, why the family values is so important, right? Because if you don't have that, then once again, it easily builds up a negative view on God. If you have a negative view on the family, it's very easy to build a negative view of God. And of course, that makes total sense, right? Because I mean, if people that you can see, right? You can see, you can hear, you can touch, right? Your family, and if they're basically garbage human beings, you're going to think God is garbage, right? That's a natural, logical thing to happen. And God knows this. God knows this. And that's why God makes a big deal about like honor your father and mother and the importance of family, right? It's because, the respect for God will quickly collapse if the family is not upheld. And, once again, that makes total sense, right? And then the next commandments, the next set of commandments, the last four, kind of expand this to how if you don't have a good contact with God through your family, then how are you going to be other people's contact to God if you yourself don't live uprightly? And so we have the next four commandments. I'm going to speed through this pretty quickly because they're kind of self-explanatory in a lot of ways, right? So don't murder, right? You don't go around killing people, right? Because if you don't have respect for people that you can easily respect, then how about people that are going to be a little bit harder to respect? You're obviously not going to have any regard for them. So, I mean, this is the fastest route. Not respecting family and people close in your life already, you are quick to disregard anyone else's humanity, which is why murder is next on the list, right? If you can't respect the people that should be easy to respect, you're not going to respect people that are going to be a little bit harder to respect, aka your neighbor, the stranger, your coworkers, random Joe at, the Starbucks, right? And if you have no regard for them, then that's easy to start killing people, inside your heart by disregarding their humanity. And then by extension, some people actually go out and actually kill people because they have no regard for anyone else's life, right? And so there is a correlation with why respecting the family is so important. And I mean, if you think of it like this, right? If you want to build a society, right? You can't expect stuff from like the wider collective if they can't even do stuff in the small, communities, right? So basically, if your family doesn't teach you to be social, then you're not going to be able to expand, you know, into small community groups and then like, getting to know your peers and stuff, right? And there's like thousands of parenting books that talk about how like a parent needs to help their kids become social beings and teach them how to interact with other kids. Because if a kid doesn't know how to do that at a young age, boy, that kid is going to have a lot of trouble growing up. And then, you think of like people with antisocial personality disorders, right? And once again, that disregard for human life can quickly happen if the family unit doesn't build that immediately, right? But the murder one is easy to see why it comes at number 6 when you look at commandment number 5, right? Because the way we regard human life in general, right? Once again, if you have parents that are terrible or absent in your life, then you're going to think God is that way. And then by extension, you're going to start viewing other lives as irrelevant. And so people can justify all kinds of evil acts, which I will shove them along with murder, right? Because there is more than one way to kill somebody, right? And it doesn't have to be a literal taking of life, but there are many ways to take people's lives, right, without actually gutting them. And that all happens because of a disregard of human life. Simple as that. Do not murder. Commandment number 6, straightforward. Commandment number 7 is a little bit more nuanced. It's one of those examples of like murder can have a wide definition, and adultery is part of that wider definition, although it gets its own commandment because it has another aspect to it that's important to analyze. So adultery is a very interesting commandment because here's a hot take. The Bible is very strict on how we treat the idea of marriage as opposed to sex in itself, right? Because oddly enough, two unmarried people cannot commit adultery. But why is adultery the bigger issue here, even though it's pretty specific? And I think the reason is, once again, it's a society thing, and once again, it's a regarding of human life, right? And so when I talked about the whole family unit back with Commandment 5 and 6, and how like if there's no respect in the family unit, then you're obviously not going to respect people outside of that. And why would you? And so when you look at the commandment against adultery, people think that like, well, I should be free to have sex with whoever, right? And so, but this is a dangerous mindset because if you think of it like that, right? Like, oh, just imagine, like, it sounds ridiculous when you say it out loud, right? Like, oh, I should be free to have sex with whoever I want, right? I mean, imagine, like, if you really look at it, like, look how selfish that is, right? Like, how selfish are you to think you can just, treat something as important as sex as, like, whimsical and to your bidding, right? And so, that selfishness can easily result in, once again, similar to murder, a complete disregard for other human life. And that's something that the Bible makes a big deal of, right? That we should put other human beings' lives in high regard, right? I mean, this is one of the many meanings of, human beings made in the image of God, right? That we all have to hold each other in very high regard. And I mean, yeah, it sounds like it's common sense, but at the same time, it's really not because once again, we read in the context of Israel, they were slaves in Egypt for like a couple of 100 years, right? And so clearly, when you're living as a slave for that long, you eventually get jaded to the idea that, like, well, I deserve respect, right? And to be treated with dignity as opposed to someone else's property. And so, I mean, what's up with that, right? And so adultery runs into that similar idea, but it takes a more personal level, right? Of you got to be careful of how selfish you think, how selfish you can be. Jesus later explains this a little better, right? When he's on the Sermon on the Mount. And he talks about how even if you look at a person lustfully, you've committed adultery in your heart. And this is, once again, it's that attitude of like, you exist for my satisfaction. Which is why do you think feminism exists, right? Is to stop this kind of thinking that you exist for my satisfaction. I mean, anyone who thinks that, we always call those people out of being like complete scumbags, right? And rightfully so, because no one should be entitled to think that others exist for their satisfaction and for their purposes only, right? None of us exist just to be someone else's property. Once again, there's the anti-slavery thing going on here too. As God started back in commandment number 1. And it extends to the marriage bed, because the marriage bed is meant to be a place that, like, no, we don't think. It starts with, a husband and wife getting, freaky, thinking that, like, we do this as, like, a consensual harmony, as opposed to I don't own you and you don't own me. We're not property, right? We're human beings in an act of love, right? Which is why the euphemism of making love exist, right? When we talk about sex. And the idea is that, like, we're making love because the act of sex is meant to be an illustration of this highest respect, right? And adultery is the complete reversal of that, right? It's complete disrespect, right? For, family, people that trust you, right? And adultery can refer to all kinds of betrayal as well. I mean, technically, if you think of it that way, right? Of course, the Bible is talking specifically about the marriage bed, but you can easily apply this to all kinds of trust, right? And how painful it is, and how much people hate betrayers, right? Because a betrayer is a person that, like, we know they have no regard for anyone else, because if you're willing to backstab somebody, clearly you're a person who doesn't hold other human life very high. Because if, once again, you're treating people like they're just stepping stones for you to get ahead in life, that's the asshole move. And people hate that, right? And rightfully so. You should hate people who do that, because that's why betrayal is such an evil act. Even though, yes, in the Bible here, adultery is very specific about the marriage bed, but you can apply this to general things that have to involve betrayal and disregard for human life in regards to betrayal. Then we get to commandment number 8. This commandment, it's an interesting one, and it's the do not steal one. Now, the thing that's really interesting about this commandment, and we'll definitely talk about this a lot more, because, I mean, there's so many laws that come back to this commandment, and there's a reason for it, is that the do not steal command is the most broad commandment, right? Because all the other commandments are pretty specific. Excuse me. Whereas do not steal is, like, super broad, right? Because, as I referenced with the adultery, 2 unmarried people cannot commit adultery. Murder is the taking of innocent human life, right? Honor your father and mother, your parents, right? Very specific. Every other commandment is pretty specific. But then it says, like, we get to commandment number 8, and it's like, do not steal. And that can literally be applied to all kinds of things, right? It obviously applies to physical stuff, don't go to your neighbor's house and break into it and steal something, right? But it can also go to, like, you can steal a person's dignity by humiliating them, right? Humiliating someone is stealing someone's dignity. Plagiarism is the stealing of someone else's words and thoughts, right? So they're like, when you apply stealing to that, right? Like stealing can be applied to so many things. And yet the Bible simply just says, do not steal. And then of course the rest, a lot of the Pentateuch will talk about like, okay, so obviously while the rule itself is pretty straightforward, you cannot steal anything, how do we, you know, deal with different levels of theft? Because obviously not all theft is equal, right? You know, stealing $5 from someone is not as big a deal as, say, like stealing someone's car, right? Of course, another thing too about stealing, an interesting take on it, is that ironically, the do not steal commandment also applies to all the other commandments. Well, the parent one is a little bit like a stretch, but like, for example, adultery is stealing someone else's spouse, murder is stealing someone else's life, worshiping an idol is stealing worship from God, as weird as that sounds. But imagine if worship was a commodity, and yes, we can steal it from God. I mean, the book of Malachi is basically all about that, right? Stealing God's worship. And then, like, you know, the last two commandments ironically come back to the stealing commandment, because lying is the stealing of truth and coveting is the desire to steal, right? And then, you know, commandment 8 is simply vaguely worded, do not steal, right? And so I always found that kind of interesting, that the steal command is kind of put the way it is. And I'm not going to talk too much more about it, because obviously I'm going to keep coming back to this commandment as we go through more of Exodus. Because when we talk about like all kinds of, a lot of the laws have to do with, a lot of the laws in the Torah, the Pentateuch, have to do with the stealing law, because I'm pretty sure, you know, the Pentateuch writers quickly found out that, like, well, crap, this can apply to so many things. We got to talk about all these different things, right? And so the do not steal command is definitely going to be brought up over and over and over, because there's just so many different factors to consider when we're talking about do not steal, right? The most vague commandment in the entire Bible, that, like, on paper it sounds like it's really straightforward. Don't steal anything, in brackets. But then of course when you say that, you know, don't steal anything, then you have to then ask the other, you know, the other side of the coin is, well, how do we apply that, right? How does that apply to society, the way we live, etc., right? If the do not steal command is so broad, then it obviously has a very wide encompassing application, which is not easy to do, right? And definitely not easy to explain. Verse 16, you shall not give false testimony against your neighbor, which is basically do not lie. This is an interesting commandment as well. And I have to bring commandment number 3 back in, the misusing the name of God, and why, once again, misusing the name of God does not simply refer to like words, is because, as I mentioned earlier, with this whole like hierarchy of the commandments, the only commandment which involves stuff you cannot say is all the way down at number 9, which is interesting, right? Because there's all these other commandments that have nothing to do with what you, well, not nothing, but less to do with what you say and more with your attitude and what you do. But then we get to commandment number 9, and it's about the one thing you cannot say. And I word it that way very carefully because, yes, the Bible says a lot of things we shouldn't say. And, you know, there's a lot, you should try and live up to that. But the Bible also makes it clear that there's one thing that we cannot say, and that is lying. And the reason why we cannot lie, well, there's actually several reasons. The first and most important reason is that, once again, it's antithetical to the nature of God, which can be said about a lot of these other commandments, but lying is definitely an easy example to pick on. Is that lying is antithetical to God, because, you know, as Jesus will later say, you know, he is the way, the truth, and the life, right? And so God is truth. And so if God is truth, that means lying is a big no-no, right? So that is one reason why lying is one of the things you cannot say, right? And of course, another thing is that a society cannot survive that. If people go around telling lies and having contempt for truth, a society could not survive. It's as simple as that. Because, there's a lot of things we shouldn't say, right? Guys, don't say such crude remarks and lewd remarks to women. You know, uh, some of us could probably have more cleaner speech and not use like so many swear words when we're talking. You know, there's a lot of things that we shouldn't say, right? But a society can survive those things, right? Even though it adds challenge to it, right? But a society cannot survive contempt for truth, right? Which is why do not lie is such a big deal, and it's in the 10 Commandments, so obviously it's a big deal. Because, yeah, a society cannot survive that. I mean, really, a society cannot survive, missing any of these commandments, right? As we are starting to see when I talk about the honor father and mother commandment, a society cannot survive this. And lying is a good example of something a society cannot survive. Because imagine if people just went around and no one was obligated to tell the truth, right? Then there's obviously no trust. So, and if no one can trust anybody, then obviously you can't have any systems run, because why would anyone invest in any system if no one can be confident of its, reliability? Because if everybody just went around lying, then nothing holds any water, right? And this is why, like, you see in like dramas all the time, right? If you watch like any kind of drama, I mean, what's always the biggest conflict is that someone starts a lie, and then people try, and then the guy, and then the person, usually it's some, asshat guy also committing adultery or something, right? Trying to uphold this lie, right? And then of course, as his life starts spiraling downward, because as he tries to cover his lie with more lies, he just ends up getting in the crapper even more. I mean, that's essentially Breaking Bad in a nutshell, right? If you ever watch Breaking Bad, I know I'm such a boomer referring to these older television shows, but you know, Breaking Bad is a great example of this, right? Like it starts with a single lie. This failed chemistry teacher is fired from his job, and then he starts, making crystal meth. I think that's what he ends up making. Um, I Wow, it's been a while since I've watched the show. It's that old, okay, and I'm that old too that my memory's not as good as it should be. But you know, it starts with the simple lie that he got fired from his job, and then of course he starts making drugs, and then he lies about that too, right? And then the people that he knows, he starts making lies about the people he knows, and he just Walter White just keeps building lie upon lie, and his life is just spiraling downward. He goes from like a victim of circumstance to like a very evil human being, right? Because as the chain of lies keeps building up, right, the more destructive he becomes, right? Because the only way to maintain a lie is to be destructive. Of course, I know, like, I talk about this, and you're probably going to look back on my older stream, and there is an exception to the lying rule, and that is if the murder rule overrides it, because human life is very, very important, and God clearly holds it very highly. So that's why murder is number 6 and lying is number 9, because the do not murder command does override it, which is why, once again, this leads to the idea that I've thought about, that the 10 Commandments do have a hierarchy. I mean, it's not really my idea. It's kind of obvious if you read the text. But the do not murder is number 6, and do not lie is number 9. And so there is an override if you tell the truth and it ends up leading to murder. There is an exception to the rule. So I might as well just point that out. Go see the stream Exodus Part 1 for more detail on that one, as I explain it in more detail then. We are running out of time, so I'm just going to finish with Commandment 10. I don't need to talk about the rest of the chapter because we're obviously going to come back to it as I read more through Exodus. But commandment number 10 is that you shall not covet your neighbor's house, their wife, male or female servants, donkey or ox, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. So the funny thing about commandment number 10 is that it goes back to your thoughts and attitudes, right? To sum up the rest of the commandments, right? And so you shall not want to steal from someone else, right? Once again, why stealing is the 8th commandment is really important, despite it's only number 8. But that's because it has so much application, right? The do not steal command. And then we get to commandment 10, which is the desire to do that, right? And so it's a reminder to always check your heart and where you're at, when it comes to material things, right? And so, but at the same time, there's the human connection too, right? That's why it's covet your neighbor's house, your neighbor's wife, etc., right? Because what the Bible doesn't say is, you shall not desire to have stuff, right? The Bible doesn't say that. The Bible doesn't say that it's bad to want stuff. I mean, that's normal, right? Like I mentioned with God playing on human terms with desiring admiration. There's nothing wrong with wanting stuff. The problem is when you're willing to take someone else's stuff because, I don't know, you find it more desirable than yours, or you're just too lazy to do it yourself, or whatever reason, right? And so the danger is to desire someone else's stuff, right? And the Bible speaks out against that. It's not so much desiring stuff in itself that's bad. Actually, the opposite is true. Desiring stuff is good. The sin is when you desire someone else's stuff, because what right do you have to someone else's stuff? And it goes back to, as I mentioned with murder, a disregard for other human beings, right? Like, who are you to say that I deserve something more than you do, right? And vice versa. Who is anyone to say, oh, I deserve more than this guy does, right? I mean, this is where a lot of people rightly point out that, like, well, you shouldn't care about what other people think and do, right? You should worry about what you do with your own life, and that's definitely true, right? Who are you to compare your life with someone else's? And that, I mean, there's truth in that, right? Because it's a very dangerous path to think that, like, well, you deserve more than someone else, right? And the sin of coveting, because you start antagonizing other people, right? When you covet, and that's a no-no, right? God wants us to love one another, and that's not going to happen if you're too busy antagonizing other people, right? Because you think you're better than someone else, or you think you deserve more than someone else. And that's the whole commandment against coveting. And so TLDR, because I'm going to try and wrap this up. I will definitely bring this back up again next week, because once again, the 10 commandments apply to everything, all the other laws that we're going to read too. And so I will continuously talk about the 10 commandments. But of course, the 10 commandments is the foundation of the laws, right? And I mean, it makes sense that they would be, because every other law kind of is a subsection of each of these laws, right? And so the whole thing about the 10 commandments is God is setting up for people how to relate, well, first to him, and then by extension, how human beings are to treat each other, right? And then, the popular, Christian passage people know is, what is the great commandment? To love the Lord your God with all your strength, soul, and heart. I totally butchered the order. It's like soul, heart, and strength is the correct order. To love the Lord your God with your soul, your heart, your strength, and then to love your neighbor as yourself, right? And so the hierarchy within the 10 commandments kind of creates this kind of circular logic thing. I'll just draw it out quickly on the drawing board. I know we're running out of time, but I do want to point this out quickly. And it is a pretty important it's a pretty important concept to understand. I know I'm kind of rushing this last part, but just gotta deal with it. Because, I mean, it is 6 o'clock and I do have to end the stream. So let's say God over here. And then people. Right? And so God empowers you to love. So when you love God, then it shows that you love people. Right? So you love God, and that empowers you to love people. And then the New Testament, there's a lot of talk about how, like, well, it's important that you show your love to your brother, you know, who you can see and you can hear them and touch them and all that. You know, how can you love God if you can't love people, right? And so what the New Testament is getting at is, well, you show that you love God by loving people. And then loving people is proof that you love God. And then when you prove to yourself that you love God by how you love people, that empowers you further to love people more. And then, wow, you know, I really can love people because of how much God loves me. And so that empowers you more, or sorry, that shows even more that, like, yeah, I really love God. I really love God because I can really love people. And I can prove it. And I can prove it in big ways. And then that empowers you even more to love people, right? And there's this weird circular thing of, like, you love God, and then you can love people, right? And so the Ten Commandments shows that, like, well, first God loves us, right? So that's kind of the crux of everything. So God loves, and then that feeds into us, right? Because God is love, right? And that's what that passage, that's what, like, you know, the statement everybody knows, but a lot of people sometimes misunderstand, is what does it mean when it says God is love? And this is what it's getting at, right? God is the source of our ability to love God and love people, right? And it's through God we can do that. And then it creates this weird circle over and over of love God, love people, and then love God, love people, right? And it works in this weird circular way. And of course, God constantly empowers us, right? Because God himself is the source of love. And so that's kind of what, you know, the Ten Commandments, you know, preludes this idea. And that's why the Ten Commandments are so important, right? Because, you know, when I talk about the New Testament, I talk about it on a more meta level. But in the book of Exodus, it doesn't quite explore the meta level of this yet. So it's kind of a little bit weird that I'm bringing this up now. But at the same time, I don't want you to get too lost. And I do want to point to the ultimate purpose of the Ten Commandments. But with that being said, this is the true goal of the Ten Commandments. And by extension, the true goal of God's law, which we will talk about in much more detail next week. I'm just going to close this now. So, anyway, with that being said, you know, I started this whole God gives the laws to Moses with the Ten Commandments, and we will do a review of them next week. As far as housekeeping for next week is concerned, since it is 6:03 and I do have to leave, and it is the end of my stream time, so as far as housekeeping is concerned, I mean, just like this week, it's going to be pretty straightforward, and it's going to be like this for like the next month, really. I'll just be doing Fire Emblem 3 Houses. I realize I don't think I'll be able to beat it before the end of February, because I have something else I want to stream, and I don't know if I'm going to beat 3 Houses by then. It looks really unlikely, actually. That sucks. But anyway, that's besides the point. It'll be 3 Houses from at least Tuesday to Thursday. I don't know if I'll be around on Monday. But if I am, then Monday will also have 3 houses. And then next Friday, I will continue the book of Exodus starting from chapter 21. Of course, we'll review chapter 20 because, I mean, the 10 Commandments are so important. And like I said, I mean, it could have been its own stream, but I decided to cram it in like an hour and a half here. And it's like one chapter, right? So anyway, that's going to be the plan for next week. With that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed this Bible reading today. I'll see you guys next week. I hope you guys come for the next Bible read next Friday as we continue further into the book of Exodus and the laws of God. Oh, come on, don't do that to me. And continue into the laws of God. And of course, you know, there'll be some 3 houses action on the weekdays. Anyway, this is going to be the end of the stream. Hope you guys enjoyed. Hope you guys leave a like, subscribe, and I will see you guys next time. God bless you.